No one is born a king, especially not when your mother was just the duke's mistress. This story doesn't begin in the glow of a crown. It begins in the long shadow of contempt. William wasn't born to be great. In fact, to most people around him, he wasn't even supposed to exist. In the 11th century, status was everything. If you were the legitimate son of a duke, you could inherit entire realms. But if you were born out of wedlock, you were a stain. Half recognized at best, kept around perhaps, but never truly accepted. William was given a name, William the Bastard. And that's exactly what people called him throughout his childhood. Not behind his back, but to his face. So how did a boy like that become William the Conqueror, the man who would rule all of England? One of the few who reshaped the destiny of Europe forever. We'll get to that. But first you need to understand the world he was thrown into, not born into, thrown into like a stray dog, into a pit of wolves. This was the 11th century. Europe wasn't a continent, it was a shattered map, soaked in blood swords and centuries of vengeance. This region belonged to the Franks. That one to a monastery richer than kings. And over there, the Vikings were still rowing up the Seine, occasionally kidnapping bishops for fun. Laws. They changed with the land. God present, but not always persuasive, especially when a warlord wanted to cut out a traitor's tongue and nail it to the city gates. Life was hard. Death was cheap. And honor. That was something you kept only if you could fight to get it back. In that world, children like William, no queen for a mother, no marriage to sanctify their birth, were meant to be forgotten. Sent off to die in a monastery maybe, or left to fade from history. But William refused to be forgotten, because he had something sharper than any sword, more powerful than any papal blessing. He had resentment, and if anything can rival the power of legitimacy, it's the raw, burning will to survive in the face of scorn. When we tell the story of William the Conqueror, we're not telling the tale of a king chosen by the heavens or a hero celebrated in song. We're telling the story of a boy hated by the world who chose not to crumble, but to burn that world down and rewrite the rules in its ashes. This isn't just the story of a king. It's the story of revenge dressed up as conquest. And when the bells rang out on the shores of England in 1066, no one truly understood what had just landed. Not a nobleman, not a warrior, but a blemish turning into destiny. William never really had a childhood. Or rather, his childhood was carved into pieces by the daggers of would-be assassins. He was born around 1027 or 1028 in the small but strategically vital town of Falaise in the Duchy of Normandy. His father was Robert the Fern, better known as Robert the Devil, a name that sounded more like a warning label than a title. His mother, Herliva, was no queen, no noblewoman, just the daughter of a humble tanner. A girl from the provinces, charming enough to seduce a duke, but not nearly highborn enough to bear his heir. And yet Robert had no other legitimate children. So he did something outrageous. He acknowledged William as his son. Publicly. Openly. Even naming him as his successor. It was a decision that rocked Normandy's nobility and then enraged them. Because in their eyes, this wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was an insult. From that moment on, William became the pampered bastard. Half noble, half nothing. And that made him dangerous. When William was about 7 or 8, his father Robert decided to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, a kind of nobleman's version of retirement. But it was a one-way trip. Robert died en route, some say of illness, others whisper poison. No one really knows, and no one really investigated. And so a child 8 years old with no noble mother and no loyal protectors suddenly became Duke of Normandy. Sounds like a fairy tale, it wasn't. It was much closer to a murder mystery soaked in blood. From the instant William took the title, Normandy turned into a giant mousetrap. But no one set the trap because every mouse was trying to kill the others. Within 10 years of his father's death, William had watched at least 5 of his guardians be slaughtered. Not in battle, in bed, in chapels, in the streets. One of them was even disemboweled while walking hand in hand with young William. What happened next? William ran. He hid. He moved from castle to farmhouse, sometimes pretending to be a servant's son. A child surviving by fear and surviving because of it. But this isn't a pity story. William wasn't soft. He learned quickly that loyalty didn't exist without power. Every death was a lesson. Every look of disdain was a scar carved into his psyche. By his teenage years, William wasn't a frightened boy anymore. He was quiet, cold, watchful. He remembered every face that had betrayed him, and most of all, he didn't forget. In 1046, when William was nearly 20, a group of Norman lords, mostly distant relatives, had finally had enough. The bastard was still alive. Worse, he was growing stronger. They gathered their forces. Calling it a rebellion is too polite. It was an open conspiracy to cut off William's head and replace him with someone more legitimate, which meant anyone but him. William was almost captured in the night. Almost. He slipped away by a hair. Then he rallied what loyal allies he had left, and with the help of the King of France, Henry the Fond, he crushed the rebellion at the Battle of Hastings. That was the turning point, because for the first time William didn't just survive, he struck back. And not with exile or fines. No. William burned villages. William hung corpses. William killed even those who hadn't fought him, simply because they hadn't stopped others from doing so. Normandy got the message the bastard child had grown up, and he would show no mercy. William wasn't taught to rule by priests or philosophers. He was taught by knives, fire, and fear. And that's exactly how he began to rule in the language he understood best: strategic brutality. By his late 20s, William had nearly absolute control over Normandy. Nobles who didn't submit were killed. Peasants who rebelled had their homes turned to ash. His name spread beyond the borders like a fever dream, a nightmare. Yes, but strangely, also an invitation to the ambitious. Because in that world, fear was a kind of stability. And that was the William England would one day face. No longer the boy running for his life in the dark, but a man with blood on his hands and eyes that never blinked. How does a child scorned by the world become a duke, feared by it? By becoming the one thing the world fears most, a patient monster. William did not rule through love. He didn't need to be loved. He only needed to be feared. And William was very, very good at being feared. After crushing the rebellion at Hastings, William didn't just reclaim the ducal throne of Normandy, he redefined what that throne meant. From that moment on, power was no longer something you inherited. It was something you seized. The throne wasn't a seat passed down by birthright. It was a chair of blades reserved only for those willing to climb over corpses. And William sat there firmly, not because of noble blood, but because he knew how to spill the blood of others. For nearly a decade, William led a reign of bloody reform. He punished every noble who had hesitated to back him. Even a flicker of doubt in their eyes was enough. He rewarded loyalty with land and stripped ancient Norman families of their estates without hesitation. No allegiance, execution. Wavered tongue cut out. Questioned him hung from the city gates as a lesson to all. Normandy was no longer the land of dukes elected by noble consensus. It became the personal possession of one man and the fear he commanded. But William didn't just rule with the sword he built. Not churches, castles. One by one, stone fortresses rose like fangs across the Norman landscape. Each one whispered to the peasants, "Don't even think about rebellion. I see you." They were William's signature, silent, solid, terrifying. And they served one purpose: to watch everything. Wherever there had been unrest, he built a castle at the center. Any noble who had once considered disloyalty, he stationed troops in a tower staring down their front door. William understood fear had to take form. And in his world, fear looked like stone steel and a shadowy figure on the battlement's bow drawn. But there was one person, only one, who ever dared to say no to William Matilda of Flanders. When William proposed to her, she flat out refused. She told him she would never marry a bastard boy beneath the dignity of Flanders' blood. Some say William flew into a rage, dragged her from her horse in the street, punched her in the face and stormed off. Is it true? Who knows? But history does record this. A few years later, Matilda agreed to marry him. And that marriage was no surrender. It was a brutal political alliance between two iron-willed people. Matilda wasn't just a wife. She was his strategic partner. She ruled Normandy when William went to war. She gave him 9 children, including the one who would become King of England. William didn't choose her out of love. He chose her for power, and she chose him for the same reason. By the late 1050s, Normandy was no longer mocked for having a bastard duke. It had become a formidable military machine governed by a ruthless, pragmatic lord. And when William looked out across the sea, he didn't see water. He saw England. He saw a dying king with no heir. A throne about to be left empty. A chance to erase the stain of illegitimacy and carve his name into history with a single word king. The French nobility didn't like him, but they no longer dared to oppose him. The church had once hesitated, now it flattered him. His last enemy was across the channel, an aging king with no sons, and a kingdom already rotting from within. William didn't need more reasons, he just needed a pretext. And history, that ever-faithful gift to those who wait in the shadows, was about to hand him one. William was not born to be a king. But after watching how kings ruled, he realized one simple truth: none of them were as good as he was at making people afraid. And that was reason enough to never let the crown fall into anyone else's hands. Beneath the cold, heavy stones of history, we sometimes hear whispers, promises made with a dying breath, a vow from a fading king, and a man waiting across the channel, like a starving beast, needing only a nod from God to begin the feast of blood. William was waiting, and the signal came. Edward, the Confessor, King of England, was a quiet man, deeply pious, childless, and far too gentle to tame the wolves circling his own court. He knew the crown he wore was just a banner in the hands of stronger men, and he understood that his death would be the starting bell in a brutal game of survival. In that game, William believed he was the chosen one. According to a story told only by William's side, it was Edward himself who had once promised him the throne. Maybe during some long-forgotten diplomatic visit. Maybe in a ritualized conversation when William came to England. But whether that promise was real or imagined, William made it real. Because history, when it can't be proven, only needs to be written in blood and iron to become law. The problem was someone else was sharpening their sword too. Harold Godwinson, the most powerful man in England at the time. A true Anglo-Saxon who knew every dark corner of English politics and had nearly all the native nobility behind him. To William, Harold wasn't just a rival, he was a traitor. Because there was one detail that William clung to like a compass pointing straight into rage. Harold had once come to Normandy. He'd been captured by William, spared, welcomed into the Duke's home, and in return, he had sworn loyalty. A sacred oath made in front of relics in front of the Norman court that if Edward died, he would not oppose William's claim to the throne. And then, when Edward passed, who put on the crown? Harold. To William, this wasn't politics. It was personal, a blasphemy, a betrayal not just of man, but of God. And betrayals like that demanded punishment, not just for the throne, but for honor. An honor William had bled to earn. The 11th century had no international court of justice. In this world, law was written by the sword. And William understood that better than anyone. He began to prepare not for diplomacy, not for negotiation, but for war. Still, he wasn't a fool. He knew personal vengeance wasn't enough. He needed something greater than outrage. He needed legitimacy, sanctity, a symbol that stood above oaths and crowns, the approval of God. So he did the unthinkable. He convinced the Pope, not just to forgive his planned invasion, but to bless it. William spun a tale in which he was the betrayed, the rightful heir, the man who would restore England to holy order. And the Pope, eager to rein in the unruly kings of the West, agreed. A banner marked with the Holy Cross was sent from Rome to Normandy. And just like that, William was no longer a furious duke. He was the commander of a holy war. From a bastard child scorned by the world, William now had God on his side. He had a cause, he had an army, and he had a grudge that hadn't yet been paid in full. England was standing on the edge of a storm it didn't know was already rising across the sea. And Harold, the man who had once sworn loyalty, was about to face the thing all traitors throughout history must eventually face: a man who remembers. A man born in betrayal. A man who learned early that in this world you kill before you're killed. And William, no longer just the Duke of Normandy, was preparing for the greatest role of his life, King of England. Not because he was chosen, but because he chose himself. In silence, Normandy began to change. Fishing ports turned into hubs for stacking timber, forging nails and loading unlabeled crates. Empty fields were flattened, staked out and filled with tents. The forges stopped sleeping, their flames burning through the night. The salty air along the coast now reeked of scorched iron. Someone asked, "What is William preparing for?" But everyone already knew the answer. He was getting ready to invade England. The remarkable thing wasn't that William wanted to do it, it was that he dared. No one from the continent had ever crossed the English Channel with an entire army just to seize a crown. William wasn't an explorer. He wasn't seeking new lands or resources. He wanted one thing: the throne. An old promise, a broken oath, a wounded pride. To others, it was a forgotten tale. To William, it was the reason he existed. From the spring of 1066, Normandy became a war machine. William didn't just summon his own men, he recruited mercenaries from across Europe. Bretons, Flemings, even soldiers from Italy. He promised each of them something different: land in England, gold titles, or simply the right to kill without punishment. To the nobles, he offered a firm handshake and a simple deal. Follow me and you'll be rich. Stand against me and you'll lose everything. They chose the former. And then William did something no one expected. He appealed to the Pope, asking for his invasion to be blessed as a holy war. And astonishingly, the Pope agreed. A consecrated banner arrived from Rome, placed directly into William's hands, heaven's seal on a personal ambition. Suddenly, this wasn't just a power grab. William could now claim that God himself was on his side. Every arrow loosed, every castle taken, every drop of blood spilled, now painted as sacred. It was no longer an invasion. It was the restoration of divine order. But there was one thing: William couldn't command the wind. Day after day, he looked out to sea and watched the waves blow the wrong way. His fleet was ready. His men were gathered. Food, weapons, horses, all prepared. But the skies held him in place. And while he waited, a new nightmare came crashing in from the north: the Vikings. Harold Godwinson, the king William was aiming to overthrow, was suddenly pulled from his throne, not by William, but by a Norwegian army led by Harald Hardrada. Even worse, Harold's own brother Tostig had joined the invaders against him. England was now a fish, attacked at both head and tail. And in the middle stood William, waiting like a clever vulture, refusing to strike while the blood was still hot. He would wait until the corpse began to cool, and then the wind shifted. One night in September 1066, after weeks of waiting, the Norman sails finally caught the breeze. William boarded his ship not as a nobleman, but as a man about to fulfill a destiny. He didn't draw his sword as he landed. He didn't shout his name. He simply stepped onto English sand and fell flat on his face. A bad omen, they whispered. But William stood up, scooped 2 handfuls of sand, and declared, "I have taken England in my hands." That was the kind of man who could turn misfortune into a proclamation. When William pitched his camp on English soil, no one called him the bastard anymore. No one mentioned that his mother had once been a tanner's daughter. Now he was the man backed by God, leading the most disciplined army in Europe, ready to claim the crown he believed was his since the days he was a hunted child. All that remained was one battle. A battle that would decide not just who would be king, but who would write the history. None of the crowned men of 1066 lived like kings. They lived like prey hunted, hounded from one battlefield to the next, forced to march, to kill, to deceive, and sometimes to step over the corpses of their own kin. Harold Godwinson was the perfect example. On September 25th, he crushed the Norwegian army at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, a victory hailed as glorious, but paid for in blood. His army had marched over 300 kilometers in just a few days, fought a brutal battle where rivers ran red, and had no time to rest. Because almost immediately, the terrible news came: William had landed. Not a month later, not even a week. Just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, Harold's men were already turning south. Every step tore at their muscles. Some soldiers didn't die by the sword, they died from exhaustion. But still, they marched, because the king had called, and a king cannot be weak. William, on the other hand, wasn't marching anywhere. He waited. He built his camp near Hastings, secure, supplied, backed by ships loaded with reinforcements. He had time to scout the land, send messages, strengthen his position. And most importantly, He had cavalry, something the Anglo-Saxons weren't used to facing. William knew with every hour that passed, Harold drew closer, more tired, more desperate. By the time Harold arrived, William wasn't fighting an army. He was fighting the walking dead. On the morning of October 14th, 1066, a cold mist hung over Senlac Hill. At the top stood the Anglo-Saxons packed tight behind a solid wall of shields. Below them, the Normans' archers, infantry, cavalry, a mixed force Harold couldn't match. Between them lay a field not yet soaked in blood, but destined to become a graveyard. What William faced was no easy task. The high ground was against him. The enemy was dug in. But he had three things: time, adaptability, and a heart that did not fear. He didn't charge blindly like some frenzied beast. He tested the line, probed it, wore it down. First came the archers. Their arrows barely scratched the shield wall. Then the Norman infantry charged and were thrown back. Anglo-Saxon cheers echoed across the hill. They believed William had blundered. He looked no different from the others who had tried to invade before, bold, proud, and doomed to die beneath Saxon axes. But William didn't die, and he didn't run. By midday, word spread through the Norman ranks that William had been killed. Panic began to ripple. Troops started to fall back. Some even fled. But then, just as the line was about to break, a lone rider galloped into the chaos, tore off his helmet, and revealed William's face. Shouting above the noise, he roared, "I am alive, and you will not live if you don't return to fight." Whether that moment was real or theatre, no one knows. But it worked. The Normans regrouped, and the lessons they'd learned from that first retreat William turned into strategy. As the sun began to set, the real battle began. But that was part 2. The part with blood deception and a single arrow that would decide the fate of an entire kingdom. There were no heroes at the Battle of Hastings. Only the ones who stood their ground when everyone else had broken ranks and fled. By late afternoon, William understood that brute force alone wouldn't win the day. He couldn't keep smashing into the Anglo-Saxon shield wall forever. That wall wasn't breaking, but it could be tricked. Earlier in the day, when his men had briefly retreated, a few Anglo-Saxon warriors had chased them. They left formation, exposed themselves, and were cut down. William didn't miss that detail. He turned failure into bait. Later that day, he ordered a unit of infantry to fake another retreat. Just as expected, the Anglo-Saxons took the bait. They gave chase. The shield wall cracked. And this time, it wasn't just a few cavalry turning back to fight. It was a full flanking assault. Harold's men were surrounded and butchered like animals driven into a pen. From that moment on, the battle was no longer a frontal assault. It became a game of erosion. William repeated the same tactic over and over: rain arrows, fake a retreat, lure the enemy out, tear them apart. The shield wall didn't fall with a glorious crash. It unraveled like old cloth under claws. And then sometime in the fading light of the day, something happened that history would never forget. Harold Godwinson was killed. We don't know exactly how. Some chronicles say an arrow pierced his eye, drove straight into his skull. A grotesque image so powerful it was later embroidered into the Bayeux tapestry, as if fate itself had been stitched in thread. Others claim Harold survived the arrow only to be cut down moments later by Norman knights who hacked him to pieces until his own men couldn't recognize the face. Both versions might be true, or both could be legend, because in the end it didn't matter how he died, only that he died. And with Harold's fall, the last pillar of native English resistance collapsed with him. The Anglo-Saxon lines broke. The survivors scattered into the woods. Some tried to make a final stand. They were wiped out. By nightfall, the battlefield had become an open graveyard, littered with corpses, shattered blades, and armor soaked in mud and blood. Some bodies were stripped bare, not by looters, but by family members trying to recognize them without seeing a familiar scar, a chipped tooth, or a worn hand. William didn't celebrate. He ordered the dead, cleared the camp secured, and waited to see who would still dare to resist. No one did, because those who might have had already fallen. A month later, on Christmas Day, 1066, William was anointed and crowned at Westminster. No one called him the bastard anymore. They called him William the Conqueror, a man not born to be king, an outsider, a foreigner with no sacred bloodline, but someone who demanded a crown and took it straight from the hands of history. The victory at Hastings wasn't just the end of a dynasty, it was the extinction of an entire ruling class. Over the next 20 years, William replaced more than 90% of England's old lords with Normans. Land law language, everything was rebuilt. England was no longer the England it had been. It became a kingdom reborn in blood, speaking a tongue, half French, half Saxon, and built on fear. And so one battle in a single day reshaped an island's destiny and redrew the map of European power. Not everyone is born to wear a crown, but some, when standing before a kingdom, will look it dead in the eye and say either I have everything or no one has anything. And William, the one they once called a bastard, chose the former. Being a king and being a conqueror are two very different things. One leads armies into battle, the other sits on a throne waiting for his own subjects to plot his murder. William understood this from the very first day he ruled England. The victory at Hastings didn't erase the Anglo-Saxons, it only silenced them for a moment. Beneath the appearance of submission rebellions smouldered. And William, who had survived a blood-soaked hunted childhood, could smell betrayal from miles away. In those early years, uprisings broke out everywhere: Exeter, Hereford, Northumbria, York, each one a clear message. We are not dead yet. And William, true to form, didn't respond with negotiation. He responded with fire. The largest revolt came from the north in 1069. A coalition of defiant Anglo-Saxons and Viking warriors from Denmark once again tested William's crown. This time, he made sure no one would survive to try a third. It would be remembered as the harrying of the North, a name that barely captures the scale of devastation he unleashed. Villages were torched, livestock slaughtered, grain stores destroyed, wells poisoned. Those who didn't die in battle died of starvation, cold, or silence. An Anglo-Saxon chronicler later wrote, "Not even an animal, a child, or a mother was left behind." William didn't need them alive. He needed them too terrified to ever rise again. And they didn't, because there was nothing left to rise from. The North became a blackened scar on the map, a message written in ash and blood. This is the price of old loyalties. But William wasn't just a killer. He was a ruler. And he knew that to truly hold power, he couldn't just take England. He had to rebuild it in his own image. First, he replaced the nobility. Anglo-Saxon names vanished from court, replaced by Norman lords, loyal to him alone. Land was redistributed, a vast map of war spoils. If you had ridden with William at Hastings, you might become a baron. If you had ever doubted him, your head was likely already separated from your doubts. Then came the law. William reshaped the legal system. He kept parts of the old English customs just enough to avoid chaos, but embedded them within a Norman framework of absolute royal power. The king became the source of all land, all authority. If you owned anything, it was because William allowed it. If you wanted to keep it, you had better pray he didn't change his mind. And then came his greatest legacy, the Domesday Book. A book, but not just any book. This was a complete survey of England. Every acre of land, every ox, every cart, every peasant. Not because William had a love for statistics, but because he wanted to know everything so he could control everything. It was said that not a single pig in the kingdom escaped William's notice. That was how he ruled, completely meticulously, leaving nothing to chance. Like a god, but real and armed. Yet for all his power, there was one thing William couldn't control: loneliness. He reigned for 21 years, and in all that time he never truly became part of England. No one loved him. They obeyed him, they bowed to him, but no one ever sang songs in his honor out of respect. In the hearts of the Anglo-Saxons, he remained a foreign conqueror. The man who turned their homeland into his private property. The man who brought fireblood and a language that was not theirs. Even within his own family, there was no peace. His sons hated each other. One of them, Robert Curthose, rebelled against him, raising arms against the very man who had given him the Duchy of Normandy. William nearly died in that skirmish. When Robert won a minor engagement, he reportedly threw William to the ground, only to realize too late that he'd just attacked his own father. William forgave him, but he never forgot. In the end, for all the castles, the laws, the crowns, William lived his final years in suspicion. He sat on the throne, but never dared turn his back. He was king and prisoner of the very power he had created. And when death came, it offered no grandeur. Not on a battlefield, not in a grand ceremony. William fell from his horse. His stomach struck the hard saddle. His insides ruptured. He groaned for days before he finally died. Death came slowly, crudely, a final reminder that whether you are the conqueror or the bastard in the end, you're just meat. William did not leave behind the England he had conquered. He left behind an England forced into modernity through violence. And though history remembers him as the conqueror, the Anglo-Saxons never called him king. To them, he was always the man who stepped over Harold's corpse to repaint their flag. When William the Conqueror died in 1087, many believed an era had come to an end. But the truth is, it never really ended. His body was brought back to Caen, to the very abbey he had built, in hopes of atoning for his sins. And there a funeral was held, one that seemed fit for a king. But even William's death didn't go as planned. When they lowered his body into the tomb, it became clear the coffin was too small. They tried to force him in, and as they did, his bloated corpse burst. His bowels spilled out, the stench filled the church, and panic rippled through the crowd. Priests recoiled. Mourners stepped back, covering their faces. No grand words were spoken. Only the smell of decay lingered in the air, like the final foul echo of everything William had left behind. It was in its own grotesque way the perfect symbol of his legacy. William didn't leave behind prosperity. He left behind change. But not change, as in gentle reform. This was change like surgery, without anesthesia. Before William, England was an Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Its kings and nobles were native sons, its laws, language, and customs born from the soil. After William, that world was swept away, not replaced by enemies, replaced by strangers. The new nobility spoke Norman French. The laws were written in Latin. The church answered to Rome. And the common people, thin, hungry folk, living off turnips and barley bread, were ruled in a language they couldn't even understand. For the next 100 years, native Englishmen became foreigners in their own land. Place names changed, villages changed, even names of people began to twist and warp. The language itself morphed into a strange, patched-together hybrid of French and Saxon, something that would one day become English. But at the time it just sounded like submission. There are no folk songs celebrating William's victory. No fairy tales painting him as a wise and gentle king. In the memory of the Anglo-Saxon people, he was the invader, the kingslayer, the breaker of churches, the burner of villages. The conqueror wasn't a title of glory. It was a scar carved into the skin of a nation. Even his children couldn't escape his shadow. His sons, William Rufus, Henry Beauclerk, inherited a kingdom perpetually on edge. They didn't rule as beloved monarchs, but as wardens of a prison named England. Rebellions, plots, betrayals, they never stopped. The Normans may have claimed the throne, but they never truly claimed the hearts of the people, and that may be the greatest tragedy William left behind. He won, but he was never forgiven. Modern historians may try to retell the story. Textbooks might praise William for bringing unity, administrative reform, and laying the foundations of a centralized state. And they're not wrong. On paper, those things are all true. But beneath the surface, in the silent graves scattered across Northumbria, York, and Hereford, there's another story. One that was never put into song, but was never forgotten. William the Conqueror didn't just change England. He tore the old England apart. And the terrifying thing is, he never once looked back. History doesn't remember the kind. It remembers the powerful. And William the Bastard of Normandy chose the only path to immortality, to leave behind a wound so deep that even a century later, people still flinch at the sound of his name. It's a number every British schoolchild knows by heart. William the Conqueror invaded England. Battle of Hastings, end of Anglo-Saxon rule. Short, simple, clean. But real history, it's never clean. It's the sound of hooves pounding on broken bodies. The ragged breath of someone dying face down in the mud. A sacred oath betrayed and used as the reason to burn an entire village to the ground. Yes, William won. Yes, William became king. But England, Was it still England? After William, the country didn't just get a new ruler. It got a new language, a new nobility, new laws, and a new memory. Children no longer sang Anglo-Saxon songs. They spoke a different tongue, bowed to unfamiliar names, and grew up reading a history written by the victors. And somewhere in the shadows of that history, the ghosts of the Anglo-Saxons still whisper, "We weren't defeated, we were forgotten." Because some kingdoms aren't conquered with swords but with time. Not through bloodshed, but through silence. William didn't just kill Harold. He killed a memory and forced an entire people to live inside someone else's past. If you've made it this far, nearly an hour alongside William, thank you for walking all the way to the edge of this story. And if you want to keep going to uncover the forgotten corners of history and the ghosts still waiting for their story to be told, subscribe to Shadow Historians. And if you think this video is worth someone else seeing, to share it. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing we've ever allowed is forgetting.